see you. You want to? I have introduced you as the producer director of the lab about the Israeli arms industry selling technology and methods around the world. If you want to introduce yourself a little bit, that would be good, and then give us some more information about what about Israeli sales of arms, weapons, and methods.
Yeah, actually, you're getting cut off. I didn't hear everything you said, but I think it will be okay. So, my name is Yotam Feldman. I'm a journalist and a filmmaker from Israel. In the past, I think perhaps decade, I've been working on investigations about the Israeli arms industry. First, as writing for the Haaretz weekly magazine as an investigative reporter, and later on in my work on The Lab, which is a feature documentary film I've made about Israeli arms dealers and the nature of Israeli trade with other countries in the world. I think what I would like to start with is what seems to me a misconception in the understanding of the Israeli use of military and police force. Because I think even, in the last, in the consequences, in the horrifying consequences of the last operation in Gaza, we hear many people thinking about Israel as some atavism, of some remnant of a rogue regime, which is not actually bound to liberal constraints and is actually perhaps a bit like the way countries were using force in the past. And I think this is perhaps a misconception, because in many ways it is a futuristic regime. I mean, it is a regime which actually incorporates liberal values of financial gain from the use of arms, from selling arms, and a democracy in some part of the country, and very, very excessive use of force on some of the people under this regime. And I think if you look at Israel now, you would see, and this is quite a bleak perspective, perhaps the way refugees will be treated in Europe in the future, perhaps the way the American army will be and is actually using its forces in other parts, and you will see also forms of political repression. You will see what happens with police, perhaps in the US, perhaps in Europe, perhaps in Latin America and other countries. And this is sorry? Yeah, and this is something I think we should be aware of. Now, if I think about the beginning of, sorry, what?
Go ahead. Go ahead. We just got you we got a bigger picture of you here.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Now, if you think of the Israeli selling of arms in the last decade, what you see is a few trends. One is the fact that it's actually growing very much bigger. I mean, it's pretty much double every few years. I mean, it's been $2 billion in 2000, and it's probably doubled or tripled every 2 or 3 years since. And another important effect we see is actually the influence of experience. I mean, the arms that Israel tests in countries in which it is fighting is later sold to other countries in the world. I can give a few examples. I mean, I think the most famous example would be until the last wars in Gaza would be 2002. In 2002, Israel actually tried to reoccupy the West Bank cities. We're speaking about Nablus and Jenin, and for the time, forces were also in Ramallah and in all other cities of the West Bank. And later on, there was a very high demand for Israeli trainers, Israeli actually showing other armies how they did it in the West Bank, techniques, ways of actually fighting, of actually getting political or effective control without taking responsibility for the population, without actually managing the population, which was quite significant. and many of the weapons. I mean, we're speaking about weapons for use in urban areas, which is useful in Israel, but also useful in Iraq, and also useful in Colombia, for instance, where the police is using Israeli equipment, and in other places. And this was also the time in which Israeli drones were starting to be used. Later on, it became much bigger. At the same time, Israel also started its targeted assassinations policy, which had quite a large global effect. I mean, it was actually, I think, the first time in the world, in our era, that a country says out loud it has a targeted assassination policy. It does. Use its military forces for extrajudicial executions, and the Israeli targeted assassinations was a very significant effect on the American program. I mean, we know the designer of the Predator drone is actually an Israeli. We know that in the early 2000s, there were a lot of meetings between Israeli and Americans about targeted assassinations, and we know what actually the Americans are now doing in Afghanistan, but mostly in Pakistan and in Yemen and in countries in Africa, is in many ways similar to what the Israelis are doing. Another interesting effect we've seen around targeted assassinations is also the question of legitimation. I mean, at first, Israel was very harshly criticized for killing people with drones, for actually conducting these executions, and once the Americans started using it, and the Brits in some or other way, these criticisms were hardly heard again. And I think this is also a very significant effect, on policies of legitimation of the whole moral and legal framework for using force against populations in urban areas. This is also a very strong effect we see of Israel. I think the next point I can refer to, I mean, in 2006 there was the Lebanon War, which also affected the Israeli selling of arms. We did see many products that were in the Lebanon War actually used in other areas in the world. But I think the next step would be probably the 2009 Gaza cast-lead war. I mean, it's cast-led since then we had two other Gaza wars, but I think in many ways it was a turning point in a few aspects. I mean, first of all, it was a war that in many ways didn't affect the whole country. I mean, despite the fact that hundreds, more than 1,000 Palestinians were killed, it was actually a war which very few people in Israel had any dealing with, besides the people in the army. And this is, I think, a very important aspect of this new regime, that war is not only profitable, but it also affects quite a small part of the population. In terms of technology and weapons, there were many Israeli products that were tested in this war and later sold to other countries in the world. To give a few examples, one is a system made by Elbit Systems, which is called in Hebrew the Hunter, which is some kind of network for forces fighting in urban areas. And we do know that this system was sold to Australia in many ways because it was tested in Gaza, and it actually affected the price. So we actually see a very direct link between the use of weapon in the war in Gaza and profit. We saw a very significant rise in the use of drones in this Gaza war, and we saw a very, very high demand for Israeli weapons after this war. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts, and these numbers are still just rising. Later on, there was Pillar of Cloud, which was the last operation in Gaza. I mean, not the one a month ago, but the one a year and a month ago, second last. And this was mainly a war which was conducted from afar. I mean, there were hardly any ground forces in Gaza, and there was very massive use of robots and drones, and these were also sold, especially to European countries fighting in Afghanistan. And there is the latest Gaza war, which I think we will hear a lot more about also in terms of weapons. I would try to say a few things about how does it affect the world. I mean, one of the theses of my film is actually that the world, in many ways, is being Palestinized by the using of Israeli weapons, is becoming more and more close to the situation in Palestine through cooperation, through transfer of information from one country to another. And I think we see it in many aspects. I mean, one, as I said, is the question of legitimation. I mean, what was once considered highly illegitimate about Israel is now quite normal, not only in Israel, but also when we see the Americans using it in the assassinations, when we see urban warfare in Afghanistan or in other parts of the world. And I think another interesting phenomena we see is actually the fact that these weapons and these techniques and these corporations are passing from different uses, from different domains. I mean, we see it not only in terms of army, but also in terms of policing or using these technologies actually against the citizens of the same country employing it. This is something we can see in Mexico. This is something we can see in my film in Brazil, in the wars in the favela. This is something we see also in regards to cooperation with police. I mean, the same methods which are being used in Nablus are also being used by police forces around the world. And I think theoretically, even drones, I mean, if we now think of drones as a way for a country to execute, to eliminate threats. I mean, we don't have any guarantee it won't be used against citizens of its own country in Turkey, for instance, where the country has Israeli drones and might be able to use it, and in other parts of the world. I think the effect on the Israeli economy is tremendous. I mean, just arms are about 10% of the Israeli market in terms of export, but actually it affects many other parts of the economy. The renowned Israeli high-tech is very much based on weapons. Many sectors in the economy actually profit and are dependent on the testing of wars in Gaza. This is something we should know and we should understand when we think about the Israeli economy, the way it is very strongly and very tightly bound with the use of weapons to the degree that it is dependent on it. If we look at the future, I think the main thing we can see is that these trends are actually increasing. I mean, in terms of sales, of what Israel is selling to other countries, we see it rising every year. We see the demand being bigger. We see it being sold to new countries. I mean, not only the US and Western Europe, but also countries in Latin America, also countries in Asia. And I think this also has a very strong effect on the way Israel, the world sees the Israeli use of its force in its own wars. I mean, the way the Gaza war is treated, and the way, even if we think about the Goldstone report, I mean, on the criticism against Israel after the 2009 war, I do not think we will hear such criticism about the present war, and I think one of the reasons for it, unfortunately, is the fact that many countries in the world are also buying weapons from Israel, also profiting, are also gaining from the Israeli experience. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Did you give him a question?
We don't have the mic. Okay, we'll pass the mic for questions.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what is the involvement. Okay. What is, excuse me, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the involvement of organized crime groups with the arms industry.
Of what?
Organized criminal groups with the arms industry. I've seen some articles that reference the involvement of mafias from Israel and Europe in some of the arms exports and also in the involvement of paramilitary security forces that Israelis may be involved in training, especially in Latin America. And you see a connection with the drug trade in those cases.
Yeah, I mean, I must say this is less what's interesting to me. I mean, I think illicit trade, the trade between Israeli mercenaries or Israeli companies and crime groups in Latin America. We saw it with the story of Yair Klein in Colombia and the drug cartels. We saw it in Sierra Leone. We saw it in many parts of the world, and this is pretty old news. I mean, this is something we had very big scandals with this in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. I think this is not so much the story today. I mean, today the main clients of Israeli weapons are actually the United States in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in Pakistan and Western European countries, either fighting in these places or trying to purchase technology to deal with refugees from non-EU countries. And I think this is nowadays the big deal. And this is nowadays the big picture. And a lot of the weapons sold are actually sold from the state of Israel to these countries. The fact that it is legal and that they're not criminals, of course, doesn't make this trade more.
I wanted to tell you that we have seen your movie, The Lab, here in Albuquerque, many of us, and it's an excellent movie. And we want to thank you for that. So 2 questions. One is, what has been the reaction to your movie in Israel? And second, what projects are you working on now?
Yeah, I think, of course, there were different reactions in Israel. I mean, some people were pretty enraged. I think it's a reality not so frequently spoken of in Israel. And if we think about the size of this industry and its place actually in Israeli life, it is quite surprising that people don't talk about it more. So many people were either surprised or enraged or saw it as something very offensive to their way of life, to their ideology. And I think, though it was still productive, I mean, it did create some interesting debates. I mean, there was quite an extensive debate in the Hebrew Post about this film and in general about the arms industry. We see a lot of people talking about it now in relation to the latest war in Gaza. So I think, you know, as far as I see it, I mean, it is also the negative responses are good and important because it makes something which was out of the public debate inside it. I'm now, I mean, my job, I work as a filmmaker for Al Jazeera, for investigative show there, and I make films. I made a film which you can see online about assassinations in Gaza and about Israeli technology being employed there. I'm also working about a bigger project, also political, but it's quite in the early stages, so I can not say so much about it.
Hi. I wanted to ask you about what you have found about the relationship between the Israeli arms industry and Israel's military and the actions taking place on the southern border of the United States. the wall, the way in which refugees and migrants are treated, and something that I have noticed very much, the way in which Latino and Hispanic residents of the southern border area within the United States, who are every bit as much American citizen as I am, are treated, and what kinds of controls they find themselves subject to.
Yeah. This is that. Thank you for that. This is something actually I forgot to refer to. I mean, I think, as I said, one of the effects we see on this new war is actually the crossing over of borders, literally and not literally. I mean, if in the past fighting a war in Gaza was considered, militarily speaking, one discipline, and the way you treat refugees is perhaps something else, and the way you suppress a demo is something else. I think nowadays it is pretty blurry. I mean, we see the wall, which was used in the West Bank, also used in Israel to prevent refugees from Africa to cross from the Sinai Desert. I don't know how much of it have you heard. We see the same wall, actually, the same technology being purchased by Americans to close the border with Mexico. And I think this is a very important and interesting aspect in it. I mean, the fact that